Hi, and welcome to CYPA Sit-Downs. My name is Nick Curry. Joining us today is Will Curry. He's played the viola and been a conductor for the national tours of Les Misérables, Miss Saigon, and has conducted shows on Broadway and at Lincoln Center. Will, thanks for sitting down with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I think we should explain for the people watching this that even though we do share a last name and we grew up in the same community and went to church together, that we're not actually related.
Right.
So one of the questions that the students asked from my viola players was like, how did you get into playing the viola? How did you choose the viola as your main interest? And then maybe tell us a little bit about what musical experiences and theater experiences you had in high school.
I started playing violin in fourth grade. That was when at Hershey public schools we picked our instruments. And on the day we could choose our instruments, my dad had played trumpet growing up, and he used to play around the house. So I felt like I was obligated to play trumpet. I never had been pressured by him to play. I just felt like I was supposed to play the trumpet. But I also didn't think it was fair that everybody got to pick an instrument for themselves. So I was determined to pick two. So I picked the trumpet, and then I went into the string room, and I was gonna ask the orchestra director if I could try the cello. And as I approached him, he handed me a violin, and I was sort of too scared to say anything else, so I just picked the violin. So I came out of that day being like, I'm gonna play the violin and the trumpet. And then shortly after that, I have a younger sister who's 3 years younger than I am, and about 6 months after I started playing the violin, she expressed interest in also wanting to play the violin. And my teacher at the time played viola as well, and told her that if she played viola, we could play duets together. So she picked the viola, and so she was playing viola while I was playing violin. And then a few years passed, and she kept getting opportunities equal to or greater than mine. And I was older and competitive, and I was like, this is not going to happen. So I decided to switch to viola in seventh grade. Taught myself how to read alto clef over Christmas break one year, which I still think is crazy. I like it didn't seem like anything to me as a 12-year-old, and now when I look back on it, I'm like the thought of reading another clef right now as an adult is crazy. And I just taught myself to read alto clef over break and switched to viola, and came back from Christmas break in seventh grade playing the viola, and that was it. And then as I played both trumpet and viola throughout high school, I ended up feeling more of a connection with the viola. We can sort of get to that later, but I sort of felt more connected to the viola, and then decided to pursue viola as a career. That's sort of how I got there. Again, wanted to be a cellist, ended up a violinist, and sort of found a happy medium right in the middle.
So what have been some of your favorite pieces to play on the viola? Maybe it was literature that made you fall in love with that instrument, or like the range of the instrument that you connected with?
Yeah, I don't really know what specifically I fell in love with in terms of the viola. I mean, I think now what I love about it is that it has such a special color, and it's such a unique sound. And like, sure, the violins get all the fast, flashy passages, and the cellos get all of the like really dark, romantic stuff. But I think the viola lives so close to the human voice in its range. And I think the fact that it is such a different color from the other two really, really drew me to it. Trying to think of favorite pieces when I was growing up. I was a Suzuki kid when I started, and I remember loving. Um, it's a piece. I think it's called Nina, and it's in like book 5 of Suzuki, and it's based on I think a Schubert song. Maybe Pergolesi. It's based on a vocal piece, and I remember loving playing it. And then as I got older, my college audition piece was the Schubert Arpeggione Sonata, which I really fell in love with. And I think also, as a violist, we get to steal the Bach cello suites, and we don't have to change the key. We just bring them up an octave. And I think that was, especially through college, I played the Bach cello suites all the time. And now I've learned as a violist that I get to steal everyone else's repertoire. So I do a lot of recital work in New York, and my pianist and I steal from horn repertoire, we steal from clarinet repertoire, we steal from oboe repertoire. We'll take some violin stuff and bring it down an octave. We play a lot of cello stuff up the octave. So I love that I get to have some flexibility and freedom in changing the colors of some more standard pieces.
You want to do the opening of that Elgar cello concerto? Sure, why not?
I'm obsessed with that. I love, and there's a great transcription of that was done actually, that the composer that Elgar approved, um, that was done by Lionel Curtis, like 150 years ago, and it's a really great transcription. Violists out there, the slow movement, the third movement, requires that you tune your C string down to a B, and it changes the whole color of the instrument. It's really special.
I think nothing excites string players more than that scordatura.
Yeah, we love that. It's a nightmare to read, but we love doing that.
So I would guess that in your line of work, still playing multiple instruments is an important thing. That you go back and forth between violin and viola. What differences do you notice about those two instruments, or why is it important to have some range there in terms of what you can play?
I always think having a broader base uh, for your career that you're drawing upon, I think is really important, especially as an artist and as a musician. There's always so much uncertainty with the career field. So I think having a variety of skills just means that you can do more things. Um, it's interesting because my violin and my viola playing really affect each other, even though I think the instruments, even though the foundation is similar, I think it's like they're completely different personalities. The violin, while it has so much more agility, you can do a lot. It responds much faster than the viola does, which is why you get all these fast passages. I think it's exciting to get to play fast and high on the violin. But what I miss from the violin, I don't get to like sink into the sound in the way that I get to as a violist, in the way that I have to as a violist, right? I think the viola color is so dark and expressive, and there's so much there that is so often unheard, particularly in large ensembles. So I love getting to draw sound out of the viola, but I also, there's so much crossover, right? So my violin playing helps me learn how to really appreciate the higher, faster, sort of more agile parts of the viola, and my viola playing helps me to really appreciate the darker, lower end of the violin, and really has an effect on both, on my sound on both sides. But particularly as a musical theater player, to have the ability to play both violin and viola um, is becoming more and more, not a requirement, but something that I think a lot of players should have, because as in some cases, as budgets get smaller, shows are sort of condensing their string books, and in some cases, it's just that we've musical theater has ventured away from what the golden age orchestra sounds like. So you've got some really clever, creative chamber music sounds coming out of musical theater now, and they're requiring one player to play both violin and viola. Or even like the pop shows, you might play viola for 3/4 of the show, but on like a big pop ballad, you might be playing violin in unison with the other two violin players, just to make it sound like a bigger string section. It's just a lot of orchestrators are playing around with that color. So to be able to play both just opens up the type of work that you can get, and even in like some of the classic stuff, Phantom, Les Mis, Miss Saigon, those are just regular viola books. But like Hamilton, the viola book is 3/4 viola, but then you play violin for 1/4 of the show. And that's becoming more common for a lot of these you know, big musicals that are coming out.
I know as someone who helps work with the team that selects a show for our high school students, finding a show that has a viola book where I'm not going to disappoint, even sometimes a violin book. There are shows that have cello, bass, and then the rest have done in this keyboard. And that can be a real bummer when I go to the orchestra and say, like, sorry, guys, there's nothing on this one to play.
Yeah, I think about that. It's I'm a big Disney nerd, and a lot of the Disney shows are just violins and cello, or like Mary Poppins. The orchestration is so brilliant, but it's just one solo cello and then a whole bunch of wind players, because it's meant to sound sort of like a British brass band. And that cello book is probably one of the hardest books in musical theater. It's so difficult, but there are no other strings.
We just did Mary Poppins in February, so yeah,
There it
we know all about that.
is.
What are the students asked about? Any embarrassing or scary horror stories when it came to either forgetting an instrument or maybe popping a string, losing the bridge right before a performance?
Yeah, I mean, I've never knock on wood, I've never forgotten an instrument. And on gigs when I'm playing both violin and viola, I've never gotten to a gig and forgotten one. Um, I'm trying to think. Yeah, that's never happened. I've definitely I've done the opposite where, especially when I'm on a show, if I'm playing a show full time in New York, I've definitely gotten home and been like, oh, I left my bow on my music stand in the theater, and that's not the end of the world because I'm like, oh, I'm going back there tomorrow and it'll be safe overnight in the theater. But there's definitely been a few days where I've been like, whoop, I left my bow at the theater. But otherwise, I don't usually I've never gotten to work and forgotten an instrument or a part to an instrument. But popping strings happens all the time, all the time. Um, I there was a period when I was touring with Les Mis playing viola for the tour. I was trying a new set of strings, and within 2 weeks snapped two C strings, which I've never snapped a C string in my life. And I wasn't even playing that hard. I was just like, the one happened 5 minutes before the curtain. I was just playing scales, warming up, and just started playing a scale, and the string broke. The other happened in the middle of the song, and when it happens, you just take your microphone off and step out of the pit and change your string and come back in. um I've broken E strings as a violinist in shows. I remember, so I just finished touring with Miss Saigon, conducting the show full time, and I remember one day I heard a snap and I looked over and my concertmaster had broken her E string, and clearly it was the first time she'd ever broken a string in performance, because she looked at me and she was like, what do I do? And I looked at her and I was like, leave, go change your string. And she was just sort of in shock and didn't know how to process it. But in an instance like that, you just get up. I've watched it happen in classical concerts where I've been in the audience, where I've watched the concertmaster break a string, take his violin, grab his stand partner's violin, and keep playing. And the stand partner gets up and takes the violin off stage, changes the string, and brings it back. So you just sort of make it work. I've never had bridge issues. But I'm also, I take really good care of my instruments, and it's a situation for me that the instrument is an extension of who I am and an extension of of my music making. So it's a job requirement for me to take good care of my instruments. So I've been pretty lucky that I've not had any sort of bridge issues, but we all break strings, and it, makes everybody around you jump, and then you laugh about it and you change your string and you come back.
I think it's good to know that that stuff happens in the real world, and you just need a practical response. I had a concert where I spoke to the concert master after the final number. I said, "What happened?" She said, "Oh, my peg slipped." I said, "What? Why didn't you say something? We could have retuned, but before the last movement." She's like, "Well, I was afraid to say something." I thought that's silly. Like, the audience is going to understand that you need to retune, and that the stakes aren't so high that we couldn't pause for a moment and do that, and then move on. But
Right. And you have to remember that the audience generally wants you to do your best. Not generally, they always want you to do your best. The audience always wants the best version of the performance. And if that means you have to stop to retune, they're okay with that. They'd prefer that, than you do the whole thing out of tune instead.
how did you choose a college and know that you wanted to pursue music after high school?
Yeah. So when I was in high school, at the end of my junior year, I had applied to and been accepted to the Pennsylvania Governor's School for the Arts, which sadly is no longer in existence. Um, but I went to Pennsylvania Governor's School. So it was a 5-week summer program, a music intensive, and I had applied and I went on trumpet. I had been accepted as a trumpet player, and I went as a trumpet player. And while I was there, I spent most of my time practicing viola and playing viola in all of sort of in the extracurricular ensembles. So I was still playing trumpet in the brass ensemble and the brass quintet, um, and the concert band, but I was any of the extracurricular composition recitals or chamber music things that we were doing, I was doing on viola, because I wanted to, not because people needed a violist. It was just that's what I wanted to do. And while I was there, I really, um, it was sort of two really important things that happened. While I was there, it was the first time that I was really exposed to a wide variety of art forms. So the governor's school was not just music; it was music and drama and um, dance and creative writing. So I was exposed to a wide variety of art forms, and we were really encouraged to get to know all these other art forms. And we were we were all the dorms were mixed up. So like I didn't just live with music kids, we lived with everybody. So it was the first time in my life that I really got to experience in a condensed way um, a really extremely artistic community. And the whole mission of the governor's school was really arts advocacy and was using uh, it was the first time in my life that I really thought about using music to affect other people. It was the first time that I started thinking about not just playing music for me, which sometimes I do. Don't get me wrong. Like music should be fun, right? There should be a fun element. You should enjoy playing it. But at the same time, I learned that my role as an artist was to affect an audience, and I started to sort of wrap my head around audience engagement, and that's what really turned me on to music. And I came out of that program um, knowing that I had to pursue music. I came out of that program knowing that was something that was very important to me. And then I also came out of that program knowing that I did not want to play the trumpet. The viola was the thing for whatever reason. That was the thing that spoke to me. And I think a lot of it was like I could only play trumpet for like a half hour, 45. I could only practice for like a half hour, 45 minutes a day, and my face hurt so much from being in ensembles that I didn't like having to pace myself in that way. Now, as a string player, we still have to pace ourselves because as you get old, your body starts to hurt. So you have to pace yourself in different ways. But I found that I could play a lot more viola and could do a lot more viola than I could trumpet before my body started to say, "Hey, you got to take a break." And yeah, and viola is really, I don't know what it was. I came out of it being like, I got to do this. I have to do music.
Where did you go to college?
Then I went to Northwestern in Chicago for my undergrad, and my parents work for Penn State, and we're big time Penn State fans. So I knew a lot about the Big Ten, and my parents, academics are very important to them. So they were pretty clear that they thought that they wanted me to go to a university program as opposed to a conservatory, which worked out really well for me because I'm also really academically minded. And I found that while I was at Northwestern, my non-music academic studies actually caused me to practice and focus differently and practice better, and sort of my non-musical studies sort of inspired my music making, and my music making then in turn would inspire my non-musical courses. And it also just meant that I got exposed to a lot of different types of academic people, a lot of different types of thinking, a lot of different types of study, and it just made us all the more curious as to what other people were doing. And it, again, for me, it further solidified my love of music, as I could look at my neighbor in the dorm who really loved medicine and was really excited about going to med school, and I could see her passion for that, and I could see it reflected in myself in terms of my passion for music, and it just sort of fueled my desire to want to do that. So I studied viola at Northwestern, but I walked in the door. Oh, I forgot to mention, at Governor's School I took my first conducting class and really fell in love with conducting there as well, and walked into Northwestern being like, I'm a viola major, but I'm going to eventually go get my master's in conducting, and I'm going to be a conductor. And the path has changed since then, but I, studied a lot of conducting while I was at Northwestern as well. And that's sort of where the viola conductor fusion happened.
When did you make the decision to focus your pursuits into musical theater?
Quite late, actually. It went back and forth. I think growing up, a lot of people had always said, if you want to conduct Broadway, you need to be a pianist. And I sort of took that to heart because that's really all that I knew. Any of the music directors that I knew were also really phenomenal pianists. For you in the Central Pennsylvania area, Stuart Molina, the conductor of the Harrisburg Symphony, has done a decent amount of work on Broadway and is a stunning pianist, really exceptional pianist. And I just sort of assumed that if you wanted to be a music director in New York, you had to play the piano. And that is 80% true. But I didn't know about the other 20%. And so I went to Northwestern originally being like, I want to conduct regional symphonies, regional ballet. Broadway might be fun, but we'll see. And then I kept hearing the same thing. If you want to be a Broadway music director, you've got to play the piano. And I mean, I played piano growing up. I like took piano lessons as well, but they were more for like the theory and sort of understanding of how music is built rather than to like make me a concert pianist. And so I never considered myself good enough to be a music director because of that. And then got the opportunity to conduct a few shows at Northwestern. And Wizard of Oz was the first one that I did. And it worked out because my best friend at the time was a pianist and she was also a music director. And so we would co-music direct together. She was a voice major. And so she could talk to the actors, but I understood how to talk to the instrumentalists. So I would conduct the show, but she would do the vocal coaching and would play piano for all the rehearsals. And we did a couple shows together like that. But Wizard of Oz was great because it's, for those who know the movie actually came first before the stage show. And so when they made the stage show, the whole show is underscored. There's music constantly throughout all the scenes. And so it really requires somebody with serious conducting chops to be able to guide and pace the music the whole time. It's not, well, the next show we did Little Shop of Horrors together, which doesn't need a conductor. Like she played piano and I played key too and like made some stuff up as we went along, but like it didn't need someone to like wave a stick, because it's more of a groove rock show. And so when I was ready to graduate, I had still assumed that I wasn't going to really conduct musical theater. I was supposed to stay at Northwestern for my master's in conducting, for classical conducting. And that summer, so this is the summer of 2010, right after I'd graduated, I stayed on campus to play a new show. They brought in the creative team from New York and I was playing violin and viola, doubling in the pit. I was the only string player because it was, again, one of these, like, it was a show sort of loosely based on Noah's Ark. So the idea was that we were all on the boat and we were just the 8 people that happened to have instruments on the boat. So it was very chambery, very quirky. So, it meant that we were all soloists. And I spent that summer playing violin and viola. I got to know the orchestrator really well. We spent a lot of time talking about conducting and me as a conductor, and he really got to know my playing well. And then that show closed in July. It was only supposed to run 2 months. We closed in July. And then a month later, at the end of August, as I was getting ready to start, my master's degree, I got a phone call from a contractor in New York who was offering me the position of the violist and assistant conductor on the Les Mis tour, because this orchestrator had mentioned me and another player in that band. And so we just, it was crazy. Literally just got a phone call offering me the job. And he knew my viola playing, so that felt warranted. But the conductor position merely came because he knew that I was a conductor. He saw me conduct for the first time 5 years after that. After I had moved to New York, after I had done Les Mis for 5 years, he happened to be at a chamber concert that I was conducting because I was conducting a piece that his friend had written. It was, he'd never seen me conduct, but had recommended me as a conductor. And then that's kind of where it happened. That was the moment that I then went on tour. At that point I was like, I can always come back to school. I had already finished one degree, so it wasn't like I was in the middle of a degree. Like I had already completed one thing. I was like, I can start my master's whenever. I'll just go on tour for like a year and a half, and then I'll come back and do my degree. That was always the plan. And then I just kept getting taken to a different production of Les Mis. And finally, when I got taken to New York for Les Mis, I was like, okay, this is it. I'm going to stay. I'm going to do this. I was like, I'm going to stay here until it stops happening. And then when it stops happening, maybe I'll go back and get the master's then. But at this point, like, I'm going to go to New York. And by that point, I had conducted the show. This was, I did Les Mis for 5 years. So I had conducted the show by that point, like probably 25, 30, maybe 50 times total in the 5 years that I did it. And it just sort of solidified me as this like viola conductor hybrid. And then that's so for up until this last round with Miss Saigon, everything that I've done has been viola and conductor until taking Saigon out on the road was the conductor gig. But it's sort of, I've always loved musical theater. Hershey's not that far from New York City. So I grew up going to the city frequently enough to see a bunch of shows. And always loved the repertoire. And then I just sort of started doing it in college. And then when the job happened, you sort of learn on the job and figure it out. And I had also had a history with Les Mis, so I knew the show, I knew the score really well going in, and knew what sort of those 80s mega musicals were supposed to sound like. And it really suited my viola playing well. And just went from there. And the music director of that company was actually the original music director from the Broadway company. He was the one that had opened it on Broadway 25 years prior. So the man that taught me how to conduct Les Mis was the guy that had originally conducted it on Broadway, which was pretty cool. And it was pretty cool to have that be my first experience, doing such a monstrous score, such a classic show, being taught it by someone who clearly knew it really well.
That's incredible. So I don't know that we all get the call and not have to audition. There were questions about like, what does an audition look like typically? Like, what would you do to prepare yourself knowing you're going in for an audition?
Auditions for actors are very different than auditions for musicians. And in musical theater, there really aren't auditions for musicians. It's mostly an entire career built out of sort of connections and networking. I tried to combine them into one. Networking is what came out. Connections and networking. And so yeah, there are sort of auditions. I think a lot of players, like if you've just moved to New York and you're trying to break into the scene, sometimes players, to get to know other players, will like invite you over to their apartment to have you play something. Or like when I first moved to New York, when younger players were asking me to sub for me, or if they were asking for me to recommend them for things, I would often invite them over and we would play duets in my apartment. We would just like get together and play, because that's a nice way to get to know somebody's playing. You get to see how well they sight read, you get to see how well they play with others, and you just like sit down and have tea and coffee and just like chat and get to know them as a person. That's sort of where it starts. And then once you get into the scene as a sub, that's how you sort of know. You'll come in and sub on a show and you'll meet whoever's playing on the show, and they can sort of get to know you that way. I mean, it's all very connections based, but like, me getting that job on Les Mis, it literally was, so there, every show, sort of the music department hierarchy, there's a music supervisor who generally doesn't conduct the show. They're usually, because when you're putting up a new show, you often need someone out in the audience who is gauging if things need to change sound levels, whether you need to reorchestrate something, whether you have to write a whole new song, things like that. So the music supervisor is often just in the house, runs rehearsals, but doesn't actually conduct. And then you have the conductor and the music director, generally the same person. And then you have a music contractor, who is the person that hires the orchestra. And they also deal with the day-to-day issues of payroll, of like temperature in the pit, of, the contract issues, because they can be very specific based on the needs of the instrument. Like, how much does the bass player get paid extra because they've got to cart their bass from their apartment to the theater? Is the theater going to provide, piano benches for the keyboard players? What's the orchestra wearing? Are they wearing all black? Are they wearing tuxes? Where is the orchestra located? Are they totally off stage? Are they on the stage? Are they in the pit? There's a lot of issues that the contractor deals with. And the contractor, again, is the one who does the hiring. So the contractor for the Les Mis tour is the one who called me to offer me the job. And he got it from the orchestrator, who is generally the person who takes the piano part. Because when a composer writes a show, it's generally piano and vocal. And the orchestrator takes that and fleshes it out for the full orchestra. So there's, again, a big hierarchy in terms of how the music departments are run, and that's, anyone in that hierarchy can get you a job. So I got the job on the Les Mis tour through the orchestrator. I got taken from once the tour closed, I got the job in Canada from the Toronto production through the music supervisor, who then took me to New York with the show. Crazy. The recommendation, though, from the tour to Canada came from the guy playing the lead. The music supervisor called the Jean Valjean and was like, "Hey, we're looking at Will as an associate conductor. What do you think of him?" And Peter was very lovely and very kind, and thankfully he liked me, so we moved on from there. But anything, you can get a job from anybody in that hierarchy. So like Miss Saigon on Broadway, when I did that, it was the same music supervisor that did Les Mis. And then when the tour went out 2 years later, the conductor from the tour became the music supervisor. And then he hired me to be the conductor for the tour. So it's a lot of, Who do people know? But then, when we were looking at hiring the orchestra for the tour, the contractor, sometimes the contractor can just hire whoever he wants. But tour can be tricky because, you're all stuck together for a year and a half in any city across the country. So it's really important to have a really, really great group of people that gels and connects really well. And so he wanted the music supervisor and I to be very much involved in the hiring process. So for that, like we had auditions, but it's not like they weren't posted anywhere. It was more, the contractor sent us a few resumes and he was like, who do you think out of this? And then if I thought somebody really stood out, we would call them in for like an interview and I'd tell them to bring a piece and then we would send them a few excerpts from the show. And I'd be like, play me whatever you want and then play a few, play this number and this number and I want to hear it. And then we would talk to them and get to know them as people and their personalities. And like, for some people, for my concertmaster, when I walked into the room, she was already there, warmed up, tuned, dressed perfectly, like everything. She just looked, and she pulled out a binder with the excerpts from the show that we had sent her. And the binder was like tabbed and marked and everything was so clean and organized. And I was like, she hadn't even picked up her violin. And I was like, please be able to play well, because everything else was perfect. Like the personality, the organization, and like that, for me, I want that in a concertmaster. I want someone who's going to be able to be so type A. Several of our players were hired that way. Several of our players, like our second horn player, who ended up being really awesome, and she moved up and took over our first horn when our first horn player left. She was a recommendation to my piano teacher in New York. I was at a piano lesson one day and, was telling my teacher that I was going out as the conductor on the Miss Saigon tour. And she was like, do you know a horn player? And like one of her former students, she had been having coffee with, a few weeks earlier and had mentioned that they really wanted to get into musical theater and didn't know how. And I looked over this girl's resume and I was like, she sounds great. And my piano teacher has really extremely high standards and doesn't like a lot of people. So I was like, well, if Carol likes Elizabeth, then Elizabeth is great. And she was really awesome. And like I sent her resume directly to the contractor and she was hired within like 48 hours. But there's no path, which can be comforting and not comforting, right? So it's not like if you're going to audition for an orchestra, you go to the back of the Union magazine and they list the auditions. Every orchestra in the US posts what they're looking for. And then you go onto their website and they'll send you a list of excerpts and, you send them your resume and they invite you to audition and that's that. Musical theater is so much more open-ended. The only thing that does audition is Radio City, the Christmas show every year. And they post that in the Union magazine as well. And you just send in your resume and sometimes you get an audition and sometimes you don't. I know people that have been like their first year moving to New York, have no theater experience, send in their resume, it has like nothing on it, and they get an audition and they win the job. I also know players that, myself included, my first year in New York, I knew the music director, I knew the conductor, I had a Broadway show and didn't get an audition. So it's like, it can be the audition scene can be so hit or miss. You have to learn to not take it personally. But there's not really an audition scene for musical theater. A lot of it is just who you know, which actually has built a really beautiful community. Because since it's all connections based, like there's really not a lot of entitlement and everybody is pretty much there because they really want to be. They really love being there. And it really fosters an environment. You would think that it would foster an environment of competition. And it's an environment of collaboration. Everybody is just there to like be nice and get along and make great music together, which is really special.
I think it's important for our students to hear that, of course, you need to be at the top of your game as a musician, but it really is those interpersonal skills that make the difference about whether or not you get the call or someone recommends you favorably to somebody else who has the position to bring you onto a team like that.
Yeah, it really is about being as good as you can be, but it's not about being perfect. Like I make mistakes. I mean, I'm very consistent. Consistency is really what's key. I'm really consistent and I bring very similar like energy levels to each show, but I definitely make mistakes and you just learn to sort of laugh them off and move on. I've made mistakes as a conductor. Like my players make mistakes. It's just how it is, and I've heard, some of the best players in New York make mistakes. And it's really so much about being consistent and so much about being a team player and being, just kind. It's funny because when I was younger, hearing about interpersonal skills really made me anxious because I'm actually fairly shy, and very much an introvert. So whenever I would hear interpersonal skills, I would think that it was all about being extroverted and outgoing, and about being sort of the life of the party and the chatty one in the room, and that's really not at all what it is. I mean, those people are absolutely successful, but so are the shy, quiet ones. It's really about kindness. It's about showing the people around you that you care. And you don't have to say a lot if you don't want to say a lot, but it's really about supporting each other both while you're playing and when you're not playing.
As a Broadway musician or conductor, what is the daily life like? Like, what is your day work? What time do you have to report to the show?
Yeah, yeah. Well, as a player, you just have to be there before the show starts. um, you know, there's some push to change, because actors have to be there at least by half hour, sometimes sooner, and half hour is 30 minutes before the downbeat or before curtain time. Sometimes if you have if you've got a really complicated lift or complicated fight choreography, you have to be there 45 minutes before, for fight call or lift call. Um, so like lift call would be like if you're playing Elphaba, you got to make sure that that thing that lifts her up at the end of Act One for Defying Gravity, you got to make sure that that's working that day. For fight call, like in Miss Saigon, there's lots of little sort of staged fights that happen, and you run them every day before the show just for safety purposes, just to make sure that everybody's at the right spot, hitting their marks, so that nobody, because a lot of these fights, if you're a few inches off, you could actually get hit in the face, as opposed to making it look like you got hit in the face. So it's stuff like that, so that that for the actors is much more strict. For the musicians, it really is just about being there before the music starts. So um, everybody has a different version of that. I don't like to take chances, so I aim to be there 45 to a half hour before the show, because then if the subway is stuck, or if I didn't get out the door in time, or if the dog had to go out right when I was about to leave, like anything like that, then I've got a little bit of time built in. I'd rather be early than not make it. So I aim to be there as a musician anywhere from half hour to 45 minutes before the downbeat. And that's just a chance for me to like get settled, unpack my instrument, tune, get a cup of tea, fill up my water bottle, chat with my colleagues, find out if there are any subs in the building that day, just to get settled. Um, so that's generally the music thing. Now, some players, one of my best friends lives in Midtown, very close to all the theaters, and he very rarely rides the subway. He knows exactly how long it takes him to walk to the theater, and he's a keyboard player, so he doesn't have to get his instrument ready. Like he'll walk into the pit 3 minutes before the show starts every day. Like he walks into the theater 6 minutes before the show starts. It takes him 3 minutes to take off his jacket, put his backpack in the locker, and then he's in his seat 3 minutes before downbeat. That is frightening to me. So, yeah. But like when you walk to the theater and when you have an instrument that is already turned on by the sound department for you, it works for him and he's never missed a show. To me, that makes my blood pressure rise, and I think that's frightening. So, I like to be there very early. But, and as a conductor, I like to be at the show an hour before showtime. But again, a lot of that for me, especially with when I was on tour, was about me being there early to sort of troubleshoot anything that might come up, right? Because when you're on tour, you're in a different theater every week. So there's always new issues. It's always too hot or too cold for someone in the orchestra. It's always too loud or too quiet, or it's different every week, and it's a different person every week, and there's always something you got to fix. Or you have an actor who needs something, or you have an understudy on that day that needs some guidance, or so I would always show up to the theater about an hour before the downbeat, just so that I was there. in case anything happened, in case anything was needed, and then the nice thing was, like, if nothing was needed, I could go chat with stage management. I could go chat with the resident director. I could, be social. Um, but I'd rather be there and be social than be running in the door and have a catastrophe happening and had to figure out what to do. So as a conductor, I liked to be there 45 minutes to an hour before the show. But that's just because, I didn't need to warm up, but there's just always the potential for something to be there. And, I like to, I'm type A, so I like to try to solve problems before they happen, or at least be there prepared for when it, if something goes wrong. And ideally it doesn't. And I'd much rather, if it doesn't go wrong, fine, some extra time to sit in my dressing room.
You've mentioned subs a couple times. I assume that at some point you might get sick or not be able to play a show or need a vacation. So what's the process of you selecting a sub or someone who wants to get a gig as a sub preparing for something like that? How much rehearsal do you get ahead of time versus just getting the book and learn it and here's when the downbeat is?
Yeah, it's that one. It's the second one. So I'll talk. So the process of subbing on a show is wild. It's crazy, and somehow we managed to do it. When you are given a book, now every show is different. All the demands are different. So sometimes, you might be ready to play a show within a week. Sometimes you might need 3 or 4 weeks, depending on the book and how hard it is. But ideally, if everyone's organized, so let's say it's my show, it's my chair. So let's say it's Miss Saigon and I'm the violist. I choose my subs. So sometimes the music director has some say in that. Some music directors are very specific as to who they want. Some don't mind at all. I think I'm lucky as a violist because people tend to have fewer opinions about the viola chair. They know the couple people they really like, and then everybody else are like, well, the viola probably won't break the show, so it's fine. Keyboard players have a little bit more of a struggle because the music directors tend to be much more specific as to who's playing those books. Drummers have a big struggle with their subs, and there are amazing drummers in New York, but the music director is going to want somebody, especially for a drum set book, who's really, really good and who also knows the music director really well. But for me as a violist, I generally get freedom to pick whoever I want, and I pick 5 subs and start training them. And so the training process is I'll send someone the book. So I will have made a PDF copy of my book. I will send them a copy of the book. I will have made a recording, generally like on my iPhone during the show. I'll just like set it on the stand in front of me. So you hear the whole orchestra, but you hear viola in the front, so that they can hear what the part sounds like with everyone around. And then I also send them a video recording of the conductor. So usually the contractor will make, we call it the conductor cam, will make a video of the conductor conducting the show that he will then give the whole orchestra a copy of so that we can hand out to our subs. And then the sub takes those things, takes the recording of the orchestra and me, and then takes the conductor video and practices with that on their own. And then they're required to audit the show at least once. So then as they get closer to doing their first show, they'll come in and sit next to me while I play the show with their copy of the book in front of them, and they will mark what they need to mark. So for some of them, it's marking bowings. Some of them might be marking a fingering that I'm doing, or marking their own fingering. A lot of times they're writing in, what the conductor is doing in this bar, or they're writing in, listen to the trombone, listen to the piccolo, play this with the keyboard, just trying to figure out how they fit into the process. Or writing down things they hear from the stage. So a lot of it is like, is this a direct segue? When this number is on, do we go straight into the next one? Do we wait for applause? Is there dialogue? A lot of it might be writing what's the cue line to get out of the dialogue. Just anything that can help them take the variables out of the show when they come into play. So then after they watch, most people watch once. I've got plenty of friends that will watch twice if they have the time, or if the show is complicated. And then when they come in for their first show, they just play their first show. No rehearsal. I'm not there. My subs are often very lucky because when I sub out, I'm often conducting. So I mean, it is a little bit nerve-wracking that in that, like, you have to play the book for the person whose book it is, but also, like, I'm not the music director if they're subbing for me, so I can't fire them. So if they do poorly, they generally get a second shot. You know, if they're subbing for me and I'm out of the building and it's the music director who's conducting, you know, sometimes that's comforting because that's the video you've watched, right? So you're at least you know what you're going to see. But sometimes, you know, if you don't do well, the music director the music director 100% can say yes or no after you play the show, whether you come back or not as a sub. You know, now most of the people that I know who are music directors are kind and lenient, and you know, you have to do really, really poorly to not get asked back. If you don't do well after your like second or third show, then it's maybe not so great. But you usually have a couple chances to make it work. Um, if you nail your first show, that's like signed, sealed, delivered right there. People are usually very thrilled with that, particularly for the younger players. If younger players come in and really do well on their first show, that is excellent for them. That speaks very well, and they will get talked about in good ways to other players.
That speaks highly for your own personal preparation
Yes.
for going into to knowing that that's going to be your job. Like that could be your shot to have somebody say something favorable about you to the next music director, or when
Yes.
someone else is looking for a sub and asking your recommendation, who's on your short list for subs.
Yeah. You know, and it's funny, like getting onto a sub list is such a tricky thing. So in terms of like the subbing policy, and I think this sort of blows people's minds a little bit. So, you know, it's an 8-show week. So we do 8 shows in the week. And to keep the chair, you have to do at least half of those. You get paid per show. So if I only play 5 shows that week, I only get paid for 5 shows. But it means that there's flexibility. So if I get called to play a chamber music concert that conflicts with the show, I can take a show off and go play the chamber music concert if I want. Um, you know, a lot of my colleagues sub in the Metropolitan Opera and sub with the New York City Ballet and sub with the New York Phil. Um, and that kind of blew my mind when I first moved to New York. I remember talking to our horn player who now at this point has moved out of New York and is a horn player in the Minnesota Orchestra, which is a big deal. He I had, you know, I was just like making small talk before the show, and I was like, "Oh, Patrick, you weren't at you haven't been at the show the past couple nights. Where, you know, do you have a cool gig?" And he was like, "Yeah, I was playing La Boheme at the Met." And I was like, "Cool, cool, wow, okay."
That is a good gig. That is a good gig.
Yeah, I was like, "I don't know how to." Okay, sure, you know, or like I've had uh one of the clarinet players on My Fair Lady is a frequent sub at the Met. So she would sit in the pit at My Fair Lady before the show and would be like shedding. Um, what was she playing? One of the Strauss operas. She's, you know, sitting there just like going these wild clarinet parts. And she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm playing Salome this weekend, the Met." And I was like, "Sure, cool, okay, that's great, wow." You know, so like, you know, people in the theater community sub everywhere and are playing with all these, you know, orchestras around town. And so the subbing policy is pretty flexible for us in the show, which is awesome. The complicated thing with getting on a sub list, though, is you know, there's a large pool of musicians, and not everybody's working at the same time. So, like when you sub on a show, if you sub for someone, then the idea then is when you have a job and they don't, they then sub for you, and you can really only have 5 at a time. So it can be, you know, I always try to balance it with like 1 or 2 younger players, and then 1 or 2 of those players that like have given me work, or my stand partners from previous shows, things like that. You know, you try to be loyal to the people that you've worked with and who have worked for you, and you know, it's that kind of thing. But it's where it gets very complicated, you know, because some of these people have been playing on Broadway for 30 years, so they have 30 years worth of people that they owe work to, you know. And it's not even owing work to, like, if I sat down right now and made a list of violists that I love, whose playing I love, I can list 15 people instantly, and that's 15 people that I would want to sub for me, and I can only ever use 5 of them at a time. um, you know, so it's always a tricky thing to balance your list and figure out, you know, who you're bringing in and why.
So you have a show that you've played for years and years and years. You know all those moments where like I have a long rest here or this number's tacit. Somebody asked, "What do you do with like your 5 minute break while you're waiting?"
That depends on the policy of the music director. So when I did Fiddler, if you've ever played Fiddler, there's just so many long, long dialogue scenes, and the way the pit was set up, the audience, no one in the audience could see me. If you were in the very back row of the balcony, you could see a few of the wind players, but nobody in the audience could see the string section. So I had my cell phone on silent and was just on my phone during all of those. We all were. I did a lot of knitting during the book scenes. I read a lot. I orchestrated an entire musical while I was doing it, like during the show. I was just like working on other passion projects. Um, on the flip side, like Les Mis and Miss Saigon, there's no downtime. And the music director for Miss Saigon has a very strict no cell phone policy in the pit. So, even he's not even like his policy is not even just like turned off. He's like, put it in your locker outside of the pit, period. Which I kind of love because it means that you're like there focused on the music making. And from My Fair Lady, we were at Lincoln Center, and it's just, that's like the next notch up, and it just felt inappropriate to have our cell phones on during the show. So with that, it was often a lot of like reading a book or things like that during the book scenes. If it's a short scene, you just sit there for like the 2 or 3 minutes that it is. If it's like a 15-minute scene, you find things to do.
One of the questions was about your favorite show to play, or maybe there were specific moments in some of the shows that you played that you looked forward to every night of the show.
Yeah, I mean, I could go through all of them. I mean, like Les Mis, it sounds so cliche, but like, at the end of the prologue, Valjean singing that high B, he tears the paper up, and then like there's a moment of silence, and then like Les Mis flashes across the screen, and it's the big like da na 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 those magic notes that everyone recognizes from Les Mis. That moment is spectacular. The audience goes crazy, and it's so exciting to do that. Dream to Dream was always really special to do. On My Own was really special to do. Those two numbers in particular have great orchestrations. Um, so like those moments were really special. There's a big viola solo right when one of the characters dies. I don't want to give it away if you don't know. I feel like everyone knows Les Mis, but when one of the characters dies, there's a big viola solo that was always really special. Fiddler was so much fun to get to do all of that dance music, and it was all new. They had rewritten all of the dance stuff for the show, and had redone the choreography. So like, the big dance into life is really, really fun. The big dance in the wedding is really fun, and there was a viola solo that led into that, which was really cool. Miss Saigon is just monstrous. For me as a conductor, my favorite moment was at the very, very end of the piece. I won't spoil what happens. It's a very emotional moment. There's a big beat of silence, and the orchestra comes in super quiet by themselves. There's no singing for the last like 3 or 4 minutes of the show. It's just the orchestra, and it is so, so beautiful. And it comes out of silence. And as the conductor, you get to decide how long that moment lasts. And it was so fun to feel the like stillness in the room before bringing the orchestra back in to move out of that. That was really, really special. And my whole Saigon experience when I played it in New York, all of it was fun because the key one player was sitting next to me, and we are very, very good friends. And so it was basically like the two of us just getting to play together all night, which was really fun. And My Fair Lady, I mean, first of all, the Overture to My Fair Lady is such a classic. So to get to play that at Lincoln Center every night was mind blowing. And we opened the top of Act 2 on stage. The curtain went up, and there was the full orchestra on this big band cart that like moved downstage. And then as the dancers came in, we moved back upstage, and we played the whole Embassy Waltz from the stage, which was really cool to be on stage at Lincoln Center looking out at that beautiful Vivian Beaumont Theater. And, it was designed, sound design wise, that as the music to the waltz started, it sounded like it was coming out of the pit. And as the curtain went up, they like moved the sound to make it sound like it came out from under the curtain. So the audience really didn't realize that we weren't in the pit until the curtain went up. So it was a sort of special, like you could hear everybody sort of gasp. And that theater is sort of built more in like an amphitheater. So you can see a lot of the audience's faces. So you could watch everybody kind of be like, and like just be sort of overwhelmed by this orchestra, which is really special because we don't get that kind of attention very often.
Were you in costume for that?
Sort of, not really. I mean, we were all in tuxes. But it wasn't like the tux wasn't provided by the theater. But for the women, they were a little more specific that it needed to be like long dresses. The conductor said if you had any jewelry on, the jewelry had to be silver. He was trying to make it as sort of 19th century as possible. Asked the women, if they had longer hair to pull their hair up sort of in a bun, like just little things to make it sort of period-ish. But if you put the orchestra in costume, you have to pay them more. So to have it be a specific costume would have cost, it's really only like $15 a person, but when you have a 30-person orchestra every night, that adds up. So we weren't specifically in costume. The conductor was. Like when I conducted the show, my top half was provided by the theater, but I brought my own pants and shoes. So they like built like a 19th century like coat and tails for the conductor because you were fairly visible at that point when the band cart was there, and like at the end of the waltz you had to turn around and like take a bow to the dancers essentially.
You mentioned that as the viola player, maybe your sub isn't going to make or break the show if you're not there. As the conductor, all eyes are on you. This is going to be hard to be a quick answer, but what's it like to be conducting a Broadway show knowing that not only is everybody watching you, but like so much of it hangs on your literal downbeat?
I really try not to think about that. The beauty of being a conductor, for me at least, is that my back is to the audience, right? So I actually have a great deal of stage fright, and that's why I love playing in pits because I don't have to see the audience if I don't want to. But I what I think about is my audience is the company. So like the people that I'm worried about and focused on are the orchestra and the cast in front of me. The first time you conduct a show, you kind of black out. It's Your adrenaline is so high, it is so crazy, and it really is that feeling that at any moment you could break the show. You could dead stop the piece, which is frightening a little bit. And especially as an assistant conductor, you don't get very many rehearsals. And the rehearsals you do get are never with the full orchestra. The rehearsals are only ever with the company and a piano, maybe. And the pianist is generally either your associate conductor or a rehearsal pianist who already knows the show, so they're not really following you. So you don't ever really get the experience of truly driving the piece until you're driving the piece. It's a little bit like if you were expected to drive a bus, but were never taught or never had to take a test. You were just like, they explained how to drive the bus to you and you like sat at home and studied how to drive a bus, but your first time actually driving the bus is like driving the bus down the highway. Like that's what conducting a show is like a little bit. Now, you have a lovely company and a lovely orchestra that is there to sort of have your back, especially when it's like your first or second time. Everybody's sort of a little bit on edge to make sure that they carry you through if something needs to be done. But you just like ride and hope it works, which again can be frightening because generally speaking as well, like the music director is in the house taking notes. And like, the first time I conducted Les Mis, here is Robert Billig, original music director of Les Mis, who's been conducting the show for 30 years, sitting in the back of the house taking notes on 22-year-old Will, like trying to figure out how the piece goes. You just sort of like get over that a little bit. But there's still that fear of like, oh my God, what have I done? Doesn't ever go away. Like I remember even like when I conducted My Fair Lady, I only did it twice before I left to go do Saigon on the Road. But my first time, that cue light, stage management checks in with you on the little telephone at the podium, and like the cue light comes on. And when that cue light went off to start the music, I was like, oh, I am not prepared to be here right now. And you just go, you just to do it. You're like just it's like being at the top of a roller coaster and being like, well, the only way off this thing is to ride it. And like, there's moments that you're like terrified of it. And then like when we got to I Could Have Danced All Night, and I felt like I was floating. It was such a the orchestra was magical. Everything, the whole experience was stunning, And like the beauty of at least music directing Miss Saigon on the road is that I conducted it 500 times. So like, it's not as scary by that point. I mean, still the first show is frightening, and there's different pressures, right? Because you have the entire music department in the audience. You have Cameron McIntosh, the producer, in the audience. You have the composers in the audience. So there's like some different stressors at that point. But like after the first 20 shows, you're like, okay, you know what parts are hard, you know what parts aren't hard, and you know how to navigate the thing, and you know that you can do it. So it gets a little bit easier every time you do it, but that first time, you literally black out. You get to the end of the show and you're like, people are clapping, so it must have worked.
Even at that level, there's a sense of imposter syndrome or something.
Always.
Like, I am not qualified to be on this podium doing this. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. How did I get here?
Always. Absolutely. Yeah. Lincoln Center was the biggest one, because at Lincoln Center too, the podium is so high. So you're like, the audience members are like right next to you, and you're like visible in the entire house. And I was like, I shouldn't be here right now. And it's wild. But the imposter syndrome doesn't ever go away, unfortunately, but it's just what it is.
One of our questions is about composers whose writing is similar to Broadway music. Like, it's hard to get a Broadway book if you're not doing a show. What are good pieces? I suppose that could really be varied depending on what you mean by a Broadway show, Miss Saigon versus Hamilton. But
True.
you love playing when you're not playing Broadway shows.
It's funny that you say that, because I actually play a lot of Baroque music when I'm not playing Broadway shows. It's something that I've always loved. And so when I'm not playing Broadway, I'm doing a lot of Vivaldi and Telemann and Bach, but I also love those because they keep my technique up. And those, especially those three composers, the music is always very energetic, which I love because musical theater is energetic, but there's like a precision and a sort of a very like clear order to how their music works, which I really like. And again, it keeps my technique clean and crisp. In terms of like Les Mis and Miss Saigon, the guy that wrote that is a big Puccini fan. So, all of those Puccini operas are very similar to what he writes. In fact, if you listen to a lot of it, you can hear some really close similarities. As in, like, most of the humming chorus from Madame Butterfly sounds exactly like Bring Him Home from Les Mis. And a lot of Miss Saigon.
I thought that's the other way, because Miss Saigon is loosely based. Isn't that the same story as Madame Butterfly?
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting because Miss Saigon, a lot of it sounds like La Boheme, which, again, who knows how that ended up happening. But yes, you would think Miss Saigon is based on the Madame Butterfly story. And part of that is because the composer loves Puccini so much. So Puccini has a lot of similarities, and also like Phantom of the Opera. If I forget where it is at the end of the Puccini opera La Fanciulla, the Girl of the Golden West, there's an aria toward the end of that is, I mean, you listen to it and you're like, isn't that in Phantom of the Opera? So like so Phantom and Les Mis and Saigon are so similar to a lot of Puccini's writing. Hamilton is like string quartet meets rap meets hip hop meets Broadway. I mean, there's so much there. Gershwin's a great place to start because, he was already writing a lot of musical theater, but then also wrote a lot of classical music too. So Gershwin is a great place. And like, all those Gershwin preludes for piano, or even the transcriptions that exist for violin, are so great because there's so much jazz influence in that. But it's interesting because I feel like a lot of musical theater now has actually taken its own voice and doesn't necessarily sound like anything else. It definitely draws from classical music and draws from jazz. But yeah, I think it's sort of become its own thing in a lot of ways. It's not, you can also get your hands on some of these books if you dig hard enough into the bowels of the internet, because they do exist. But yeah, I think, for the big and for the golden age musical theater stuff, a lot. You can find some transcript, like, Heifetz did some transcriptions of Gershwin and Richard Rodgers and things like that. Um, but that music sort of took on its own voice. So I don't really know classical people that are like that.
We grew up in Hershey, Pennsylvania, the booming metropolis of Hershey, Pennsylvania. Can you give some tips for somebody who's moving to New York or another big city? How do you navigate that for the first time, get connected, figure out what to do?
Yeah, for me, like, I always wanted to live in the city. I love living in the city. I think it is thrilling. I think it's exciting. It's very different than living in Hershey. Some of the comforts of living in Hershey don't exist in the city. You sort of trade those for, you know, being able to get Thai food at any hour of the day. Like, that's like, there are pros and cons to living in New York, as there are pros and cons to living in central Pennsylvania. Like, the air quality is probably better in central Pennsylvania. But, you know, on a given night, I could just go buy tickets to the Met and go see world-class opera kind of whenever I want. So like, this sort of the trade-offs for what you're going for. I mean, the biggest thing for moving to a city is just learning how to navigate, figuring out how you're going to get around, figuring out what the public transportation system looks like, and like just getting acquainted with that and learning how to get yourself from point A to point B around the city. And, for your first year, that might take a little extra time figuring that out. Sometimes for a lot of these, cities, it's like learning a map. It's like learning a language. Um, it's funny because now, like when I travel, like if I travel to Europe, I can figure out another city's subway system really quick because I'm used to looking at New York's and figuring it out really quick. Um, but it took me a while to get used to New York, and I started off being really good at my line. I lived on the F line, and I knew what the F line stops were, and I knew what stop I knew what stop I lived on, and I knew what stop I had to get off at. And nowadays, the beauty of like Google Maps is it'll tell you that, and you learn. The Google Maps version will you generally always work. It may not be the most efficient, so you do it, and then you start to learn other ways to do it faster and better. And I think the trick to living in New York and being happy living in New York is, like, one, you gotta like cities, and two, you just find the things that you like and you put them into your life, right? So for me, I'm like an avid tea drinker. So like what helps me do better in New York is like knowing what tea shops or coffee shops have really good tea. So like when I'm in Midtown and have a half hour to spare before the show, I'm like, oh cool, I'm gonna run over here to this little coffee shop because they've got a great tea and I can go sit there for 20 minutes and read, or check some email and take care of some things. And then, it's about finding a way to get into a community and start meeting people. So like, it was tricky for me when I first moved to New York because I was very lucky that I had a show. I had a job, which was awesome, but it meant that I had no evenings or weekends free. I had no time to meet people my age. Everyone I was meeting, was 15 years older than me, and they were lovely, but like they all had families and their lives. And, now I've become very close with them because I've worked with them for, 5 or 6 years. But when I first moved to the city, they weren't mean. They were perfectly lovely, but they had their own lives and their own friends. And I was the new kid, and they all kind of assumed that I had my life and friends. And I was like, I don't. And at that point, all my friends from college lived all over the country. And I've been very lucky that a lot of my two best friends from college ended up moving to New York. Took us all different amounts of time, but we all got there eventually. So the three of us are now all in the city. And the keyboard player from Saigon has sort of become a fourth in our friend group. And one of the best things for me when I moved to New York, because I couldn't join like an intramural sports team, or, I couldn't be part of my building's like garden club. Like I couldn't, the building had plenty of offerings of like great social stuff to do, but it was always at night or on the weekends, and I didn't have those free. Um, you know, like I couldn't go to the local like running store and join their Tuesday night running group because I didn't have Tuesday nights free. So after about 6 months of living in New York, I knew I wanted to build my teaching studio, and there's a great Suzuki training program in the city. So I applied and got in and joined the first year Suzuki training group at School for Strings, and suddenly had a class. There was 15 of us. Many people were either freshly out of school. It was actually a whole range of people. We had some older women who had been longtime Suzuki teachers that just wanted to take the training again to brush up their skills. Somebody else had just moved to New York and was trying to break in. It was a lot of people that were my age that were either right out of college or had just moved to New York. And I suddenly had a little like mini community. And, we met once a week, and but it was a 2-year course. So like over the course of 2 years, I became really close with a lot of these people. And one of them now is someone who subs. She's a violist. She subs for me all the time. Is one of my very good friends in New York, and got me my first teaching job in New York because of our connections there. And so like I joining that group and like going to class essentially every week was a really great way for me to meet new people in the city. And then as you spend more time there, you start meeting people, and you start like one of your colleagues invites you over to their house for a dinner party, and then suddenly you like make a few new friends, and then you just start building the circle out of there. So I think my biggest advice is like just be patient. Like we've all got technology and we're all getting good at this social distance. I don't know if good is the right word, but we're doing this social distancing thing. So like the beauty is like you FaceTime your friends that don't live in the city, you call your parents, you sort of exploit your virtual social group until you start to find your real life like your real in-person friends in the city. It just takes time, but it's about finding a group of people that you really love, and then also doing the things in the city that you love, you know whether it is running in the park or finding your coffee shop or things like that.
One final question.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to those high school students whose dream it is to play in a Broadway show? What things should they be working on, skills that they should be developing to get ready to be at that level?
Yeah, I think when I was growing up, I often thought sometimes that musical theater was easier than classical music, and it's not the case. It's very, very different, but I think one of the best things you can do is just to get really good at your instrument. And that's not just being in a practice room. That is being in a practice room, but it's also being in the room with other people, whether it's chamber music or sonatas or, playing in the jazz band or being in a jazz trio, like anything, getting really good at playing your instrument and then getting really good at playing your instrument with others. No matter what the style is, it all crosses over. To be able to communicate thoughts through your instrument and to be able to meld those thoughts with the people around you is the biggest skill. So like that's a really important thing. Again, being super comfortable on your instrument is really, really important. And no matter what that is, that could be the harmonica, that could be, being really good at playing the Tchaikovsky violin concerto, whatever, being really good at whatever skill set you're presenting is really important. And then, for me, it was helpful to just listen to everything, be exposed to as much style as possible, and we're kind of in this crazy time right now. And this crazy time can be amazing in that, like, the Metropolitan Opera, every single night on their website has an opera that you can watch for free. The New York City Ballet, you can watch a ballet. They put a new one up every 3 days for free. There's all these theaters. Andrew Lloyd Webber every weekend puts one of his shows up that you can watch for free. So you can get exposed. And also on top of that, we have YouTube and Spotify and all of these things, even like good classical radio stations. You can just listen to everything. And just being exposed to as much music and style and performance as possible is so important. Because you never know when you go to do something and you're like, oh, I know this piece, or I know this composer because I watched it 10 years ago. I know this aria because this is the scene when Renee Fleming runs around in the leaves, and now I get to play it. Like it's just like anything like that can trigger memories in the future and can be helpful for you as a player. Or in my case, like as a conductor. In musical theater, the beauty is that there's so much variety of style and so much required from the band and so much flexibility required from the band. So just being exposed to as much as possible. I think those are the two. And then, yeah, and also spend time cultivating being really kind to everybody around you. Because it doesn't matter who they are, like you can practice being kind to everyone and those skills will automatically apply, because the thing is, when you walk into a rehearsal room, you're nervous. When you walk into a room for the first time, you're nervous and you're scared, and you go into your defense mechanism. And if you've practiced being kind and loving to people, it's the same thing as like playing your scales. Like when you're scared and you sit down to play your instrument, if you've practiced enough, you're going to feel comfortable on your instrument. And if you've practiced being kind and interacting with the people around you in a way that is collaborative and loving, then that becomes second nature, and you don't have to worry about it when you're already worried about playing the right notes at the right time. um,
That's really great advice. Will, I want to thank you so much for sitting down with us and doing this interview. Good luck with your future pursuits whenever we start to go back to whatever the new normal is. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. Thanks.